We're going to call to order at 3 o'clock the P&Z workshop.
Sounds good. So had quite a few questions from new members, or I guess not current, seasoned members of P&Z. Just want to kind of walk
What
through.
do you mean seasoned members? What are you talking about?
Those
Gotta
that
say
have,
we're old?
those that have served a couple of years. Just a couple questions about policies, procedures, that sort of thing. So we wanted to kind of take that opportunity to go. I know each of you had orientation. I think each of you, I've given a brief orientation at least. So I know, Mike, you had orientation
Yes.
prior to me coming on
Yes.
your first go-round. So just want to kind of touch base on those, some of the fundamentals of P&Z zoning, some of the basis that we look at when we make a recommendation to you, and so on. So here's a nice quote from Socrates. By far the greatest and most admirable form of wisdom is that needed to plan and beautify cities and human communities. I cannot take credit. That was Mr. Hayes.
Is this where we turn in our resignations?
No threats, no veiled threats.
It's Mr. Hayes' stand-up comedy hour. I'm just holding the mic. So we'll kind of run through, obviously, tools of the trade and what we're working with, starting with comprehensive plan as your kind of overarching guiding policy. It is not law. It is just a guidance. It gives you the input from the community on how to make some of these decisions. That's what staff looks at when we make a recommendation to say it is or is not consistent with those policies. Again, those that were involved and those that were are aware of it, those that weren't involved, Kerrville 2050 plan, we had substantial input from the community. Some of the best community engagement I've ever seen for that process. It's fairly typical that a city will reach and stretch to get 1% of the population to attend and participate. Collectively, we certainly exceeded that. Great community outreach through that process. So we do put a lot of stake in that plan because it is the community's plan. It's also a living document, and we'll kind of touch base on that too here in a little bit. Subdivision code, we get real black and white, real cold, real quick. Subdivision code is, by law, very black and white. It's not very subjective. As I know we've talked about several plats, not all plats come before the commission. There are some smaller plats that are reviewed on the administrative level. Those that come to the commission, the only reason you can deny them is if you can pinpoint where they are insufficient to meet the code. Most of the time, actually I would say 100% of the time, I don't know that I've brought a plat to the commission and recommended denial. We try to work that out with the applicant before they get in front of you guys. If they're that insufficient, staff gives them a comment that says, hey, you're short, you're not going to be recommended approval, your plat will be denied, or you can withdraw it. We'll just come back next month when we've got all the things ironed out. So with the subdivision stuff, obviously you guys have seen through our presentation, it's approve or approve with conditions. Staff will review those final conditions and move them on to approval there. The zoning code, state law gives home rule cities a lot of breadth on what the zoning code is for the city. It is customized city to city. They make their own. There obviously are some consistent standards out there on how they're established, or not how they're established, how they're organized, what the uses are, how they interact with different districts. Ours is more of what's referred to as a Euclidean zoning based on a court case in 26?
Yes.
I think 1926. Part of the establishment of land use zoning in the early 1900s. A lot of that does stem from housing standards and the industrial revolution and those standards, both for housing and jobs. That's carried over into what we see today. Sign code, Planning and Zoning Commission does have authority over the sign code for variances as well. We'll have a variance coming to you in September. I don't think, Mike, you're the only one maybe David, that have seen a sign variance. We don't have them very often. The threshold is pretty high. for the most part, just like a zoning board of adjustment variance. But we will have those. All of these codes are available on the city's website. The comprehensive plan is on the website. The other three are in Unicode. That's a code service that we hire that codifies them. I know the previous zoning code was never included in that. When we adopted the 2019 zoning code, that was incorporated into Unicode. So it's kind of a table of content format, and you can scroll through and hyperlinks and so on. Good for word searches to get through all those chapters. A little more about the comprehensive plan. Again, it's geared towards, obviously, comprehensive. What are the goals of the community? I've always kind of said the comprehensive plan is what we want to be when we grow up. Where is Kerrville in the next 20, 30 years? Again, all shapes and sizes these days. It is required by state law. If we have zoning, you are required to have a comprehensive plan. I know early on in the late 70s, early 80s, when that requirement came out, a lot of cities took their zoning map and called it a comprehensive plan. Those days are obviously long gone. There's a lot of thought and a lot of work that goes into those comprehensive plans to make them a community strategic plan, more or less.
So what the statement, if a city adopts a comprehensive plan, it must be followed when making zoning decisions.
We've reviewed several of those specific statements through cases. When we say these are consistent with the plan, comprehensive plan, you guys have seen me put quotes out of that plan in presentations. We have had a handful of cases where we say this is also a minor change to the future land use plan. Some of those were really the areas that are on the outskirts of town or on the edge of city limits. Areas designated as ag as kind of the placeholder. Done a little deeper dive on study and market and what's being proposed. And those minor changes go in the ordinance, the whereas statements of your ordinance that you're recommending to council to amend the comprehensive plan and change the zoning in one
So
action.
where, this statement, where is this in the city's, that's the first time I've seen that statement. Because I mean, I hear the comprehensive plan come before P and Z and city council a lot. This is what your comprehensive plan says. This is what your comprehensive plan says the city should do, but it's pretty much, it's an abstract idea. I don't think it's, so where is this?
This
Could
is in
someone
the-
go to the city government, city whatever, and come back and say, it says in the law that if you've adopted a comprehensive plan, you must follow it in making zoning decisions. Is that somewhere in writing, somewhere?
So this is local government code, state statute, chapter 211. As it relates to zoning, it's the future land use plan. All of the other chapters in the comprehensive plan are more for the other cities' goals, not directly to the zoning goals. Obviously, we look at mobility and paving plans, those don't relate to zoning.
Sure.
The housing chapter overlaps with zoning certainly on policies of how to gain more housing. But the future land use, the land use chapter and the future land use plan is the statement here, is what that's
So,
aimed towards.
and again, I'm just trying to understand, that doesn't say land use. That
Right.
says if a city adopts a comprehensive plan, it must be followed when making zoning decisions. So when I hear all these people come up here and we're talking about these short-term rentals, they're going to the comprehensive plan and they're saying that comprehensive plan says that we should protect the integrity of the neighborhoods.
True. So those quotes are coming out of the community and neighborhood chapter. Obviously, the goal is to protect neighborhoods. The zoning, I would argue that the zoning code does protect neighborhoods in that we have standards and regulations for short-term rentals. So those standards that we've put in the zoning code are the protection for the neighborhood. Currently, we're under discussions of amending those standards for short-term rentals to better protect the neighborhoods. So I think the current does protect the neighborhood, does follow the comprehensive plan. Now the community's discussing through you guys and council and obviously staff working through that. Are we protecting the neighborhoods as much as we should? Or do we need to improve those standards within the zoning code.
That's a pretty strong statement right there.
And then, I know you guys have looked through the comprehensive plan, the economic chapter is gonna say the opposite. You should provide economic opportunity within the city. So you guys get that balancing act of where is the zoning restricting economic opportunity? Where is economic opportunity having a negative impact on the neighborhood?
And I would be interested in your interpretation here, Mike, because I've never, maybe I didn't read it like I should have, but I've never seen that statement. And that's, if a citizen came up here and said, listen, we've adopted a comprehensive plan, so you must base your zoning decisions on that. That's a pretty,
Yeah, well, and, so, one thing, Drew really hit the nail on the head. He really, I thought, used some good words and some descriptions and of what a comp plan is versus a zoning code. Keep in mind, a comprehensive plan is very general terms.
sure is.
Right, and it's a plan, right? And then the zoning code is more specifics. And I've heard Drew say this before, because he certainly knows the comp plan, both the comp plan and the zoning code, much more than I do. But I've heard him tell applicants, that doesn't comport with our comprehensive plan. You're gonna need to, if you wanna do that, you're gonna have to go to P and Z and then council and get the comprehensive plan changed. If it's kind of a tweak, as Drew alluded to like the land use plan, in the comprehensive plan, that we'll carry that forward as part of the zoning amendment, and you'll see that section within that zoning amendment ordinance, and there'll be a section that actually changes the comprehensive plan or orders the city manager or designate to do that. So, it's always a balance. We do take it very seriously. I heard the statements at the town hall meeting about this violates the comprehensive plan. I mean, I could argue the other way, right? As Drew just talked about, that yes, we want to uphold the integrity of neighborhoods, but we also want to make sure people have a right to some sort of economic benefit from their property, right? And that's the balance. That's why you all get to do these neat things, make these really neat decisions at least once a month, because there's always a balance, right? And you're hearing it. Your constituents are, the applicant, neighbors, surrounding areas. I mean, and if it's an R1, it could be an R1 on the other side of town that's interested in what y'all are doing. And so there's competing interests, balancing of interests, and at the end of the day, hopefully when the smoke clears, you all have made a wise decision based on all the
Your
facts.
definition of need and mine is different.
Well, maybe, but
I understand what you're saying.
yeah.
So, and again, I'm just trying to understand, land use and zoning. Tell me how they come together or how they separate.
So, some communities actually title their zoning code land use zoning, because it is dictating the regulations, where you
Pretty
can,
much
where
the
you
same
can't
thing, right?
use land use, correct. The land use chapter of the zoning, or the comprehensive plan, are those guiding principles, those policies that drove the rewrite of the zoning code. There are specific elements in there that do talk about, where we should and should not have certain types of uses. The future land use plan, you see that in the maps that I put up all the time, as far as where community commercial, regional commercial, transition neighborhood, or single family or ag should be located generally about the city. Again, we do make some modifications to that through zoning cases. That's kind of the higher level than zoning, because we're not going into each individual district. Community commercials, I kind of equate to your Main Street, Sidney Baker. And as you get up to the interstate in Sidney Baker, that's your regional commercial. Obviously, you've got a regional highway. It's going to have a lot of draw there. So then you take those categories and apply those to the zoning code. And it's not one for one, but your community commercial is more of your C2. Your regional commercial is more of your C3. And you'll have areas where those overlap, and it's not a clean line. It's not black and white. But I know, like the case we had a few months back on Loop 534 for Mr. Hamilton. On a regional highway, comp plan says community commercial, not regional commercial. Obviously, the loop is TxDOT road. There's a lot of regional traffic on that highway. Went ahead and zoned it C3, which is more of your larger big box stores. However, the acreage of that doesn't allow a Home Depot, a Lowe's, a mall, HEB, those sort of things. So when we give a recommendation on how we think the request fits the comprehensive plan, try to take all of those things into account and oversimplify it into a statement, this is or is not consistent with the comp plan. A little more clear how they start tying together. And we'll, like I said, we'll keep going. There's more on this, not that specific section, but how those all kind of intertwine. Again, generally, a lot of your comprehensive plans today are going to have your community vision, goals, future land use, transportation, public facilities, parks and rec, community growth, and implementation plan. You notice ours captures almost all of those. We added housing because that was a big, important topic for the community. Growth, we don't have a separate chapter on growth. There's statements throughout the land use, the community, the economic chapter. All of those have comments about growth and how the city should grow. The community really put a focus on internal growth and actually bringing more density within the current city limits. Annexations should be somewhat strategic, which we get into that a little bit on the annexation law, but we're not just reaching up and down the river valley as far as we can go. We've kind of set our ends where we are, and we're going to try and do those infill projects and fill in those gaps with smaller annexations. Let's see. Again, kind of going back to the process. Those that were involved, you saw we had some tabletop exercises with the community to develop the comprehensive plan. Several different town hall meetings based on specific chapters. Transportation and mobility, land use, and the economic side. I'm trying to think which other ones we had town halls on. Parks and recs and open spaces, obviously a big part of our community with the river and the river trail. So through that process, that comprehensive plan is built to give you guys some of that directive. Kind of switching over again to subdivision regulation. Again, this is to regulate the division of property into the kind of urban fabric from raw land. Gives the process, gives the standards and the expectations. And ultimately, the state law says subdivision regulations are adopted to promote health, safety, morals, and general welfare for the city and its safe, orderly, and healthy development. So I think some of the ones that we've gotten into discussions on are like the thoroughfare plan. How does the thoroughfare plan intertwine with the subdivision proposal? If you're within one of the areas where there's a future collector or a future arterial, through the orderly development of the city, we've established we need a connection for some kind of roadway through your property or somewhere around there. We allow the developer to then dictate where that goes and how it aligns. Obviously, at the ends of it, we have a connection point in mind. So that's kind of where some of those start to overlap. For the most part, subdivision regulation is pretty black and white. We do have subdivision regulation, if you guys have seen, in the extraterritorial jurisdiction. So that's the area outside of the city limits, based on population, is based on the size of the ETJ. We are under 25,000 currently, so we have a 1 mile ETJ. Once we officially break 25,000, our ETJ goes to 2 miles. I think is it 50 or 100?
Oh, 100.
100,000 goes to 5 miles. Ingram.
Is that based solely on when we, every 10 years doing the census?
No, the city council can determine their own population.
Good.
Obviously, you have kind of that benchmark every 10 years with the census. Most cities will say they have better data than the Census Bureau because we're in it weekly, if not daily, rather than every 10 years. But they try to aggregate where they can and so on.
When does that next one happen, Drew?
Well, the next census will be 2030.
There in 10 years.
But council can use the data that we have and say, we're at 25,000.
Is there a set, do they look at that every year, or is it like they look at every
We
2
do.
years?
Through the budget process, water utilities uses population based on some of their standards, or public works, I guess, for water and sewer. Through the budget process, we look at it just kind of as a benchmark as to where we are. Kim, the library has standards based on city and county population. So the population has legal impacts through state law for different departments. So we do keep track of that.
Are we obligated, Kim, if you guys determine that we're over 25,000 is arbitrary, then you have to notify somebody and say, our extraterritorial jurisdiction is now 2 miles? Or do we,
We're not obligated to do that, as far as I know. I've looked at that issue a couple times, I've been asked. I think it's really a discretionary act of council, but once they decide to look at it and to perhaps even do it, they would have to make that finding. And as Drew mentioned, we would probably use, census data, utility hookup data, and, persons per household kind of deal, and matched up. I mean, obviously, the more data and the more evidence you can put in there, you want to really do that, so.
is it better, Mike, to have some to control 2 miles out than 1 mile out, or is it worse? What do you think?
But both. I would characterize it from my position both ways. We do regulate subdivisions, and so platting in the ETJ now, and we have a good relationship with the county on doing that, and we do signs. I don't know how much permitting we actually do in the ETJ. Occasionally, we'll have a sign that goes up right outside the city limits, and we can go to them and say, hey, per state law and our ordinance.
That was one of my
Right.
biggest things,
Yeah.
about signage.
Yeah, sure. And occasionally, cities will have that where, folks will go, oh, here's the city limits, here's a big billboard. And so, and that's happened to us, and we've had to go out and kind of
Okay.
nudge them a little bit, so.
I wouldn't say we have a daily enforcement process in ETJ,
But I
but
think
as we see something or have
once
complaints.
or twice since I've been on P and Z, we've ever dealt with an ETJ issue.
Just a couple plats.
Yeah.
Again, on the enforcement side, a handful of signs here and there. I think in the last year, just off the top of my head, we've done 2 or 3 sign permits maybe?
So we do addressing signs.
Addressing and signs. We've got a good partnership with Kurt 911 for addressing, because they do addressing in the county, we do addressing in the city. Both of our resolutions say we do addressing in the ETJ, so we work together to make sure we're addressing in the same direction at least. So that's, sorry, I jumped ahead. That's kind of that ETJ regulation. There's not a lot more other than you can define things as nuisances, which we don't have any, or we have not defined any. Subdivision and signs are the only pieces that we regulate in the ETJ. Getting back to zoning and kind of the basis, obviously once you have subdivisions and division of land, more of the physical sense, now looking at zoning districts and dividing the land into areas for commerce, for industrial manufacturing, for residency, kind of your 3 main categories. And then, as you've seen, we've got everything in between there. A lot of that is based on context of where we are, topography, roads and access, utilities. And we've seen some development areas. You can probably drive around town and point at some areas that you've seen that just never develop. Probably utility, access, fire code, some level of code requirement that allows those not to be developed. We try to take that into account when looking at zoning and applying zoning. I think one that comes to mind just first is the property we looked at off of Loop 534 adjacent to the golf course, kind of that little triangle right there on the hillside. Again, on flat paper, looks like a reasonable place for an apartment complex. You've got loop access, golf course view. You drive out there and stand on the edge of the highway and look at the property and try to figure out how are you building anything.
Yeah, pretty steep.
Yeah, so it's obviously 3 dimensions here makes a big difference on how we look at these projects. Land use plan takes some of that into account. The future land use plan takes some of that into account. The thoroughfare plan takes some of that into account. If we've got a road planned through a vacant area, at some point we've got to look at the topography and see if we can even build that road. Or is it going to look more like the interstate where you're blasting channels through it just to get a grade that we can actually drive on without, you know, four-wheel drive or a Jeep or an ATV. So zoning kind of gets down that next granular layer on where do we put those different uses. There we go. There's the Village of Euclid, the Euclidean zoning that I talked about. That was one of the first Supreme Court cases where they really looked at a city's ability to dictate how someone used their property. Obviously, property has always been held to a high standard for property rights, and then the police power to balance that, those regulations that we put into place. You want to talk more about the next one?
I was going to say something too, at the risk of going back. No, I don't want to go back. No, I'm not going to go back. I refuse to go back. But I do want to say, appreciate y'all being here. I know this is early. It's an extra meeting this month. Your pay will address this situation you find yourselves in. I want to thank Drew for helping, go through these slides and really putting some planning perspectives on it. Sometimes I kind of drill down into the legal issues, and he'll go, let's not, those are real, meaty legal issues. Let's be a little bit higher level. So I appreciate him looking at this stuff. And it's funny when I recall certain things, but that slide or two ago, we're talking about morals, and that's out of state law. Boy, I had a mayor one time that every time I put that into an ordinance, he hated it because he firmly believed that you could not legislate morals. And whether you agree or not, I don't know, but he would just hammer me every time, and I'd tell him, Mayor Smith, I don't know if y'all remember him. I'd say, Mayor, I'm just tracking state law. So that always, I get a chuckle out of that whenever I see that. But we do need to power through this stuff, but we want you to ask questions like you've been doing, and if you've got a question on anything. And I would say that you want to do that during meetings as well. If you get to a meeting and you're considering an application, whether for a plat or a zoning amendment, and if you don't understand something and we haven't addressed it either in the agenda bill or our presentation, you need to stop, because it helps everyone, in my opinion. It helps the applicant, it helps the neighbors if they're here. Who it really helps is council, and council tells me all the time they're watching y'all's meetings just to get a feel for what's coming to them and what the issues were here at this meeting. And so anytime you all can, drill down perhaps because you don't understand an issue, or you want to understand an issue better, by all means, ask a question to go through that. Here, well, let me just say one thing about platting and then even sign code. We're not going to go into the sign code very much and at all anymore because of the interest in time, but clearly that's one of y'all's ordinances under your purview. I think the most important thing under subdivision code, which Drew touched upon, is that is a non-discretionary act. That we have standards in place through our subdivision code and through public improvement standards, type of pipe and where the pipe goes and all that stuff. And so that is a non-discretionary act, and basically Drew's correct. If that plat comes to you and we're telling you it matches up with our ordinance, then you all really have to adopt it. And I get it. Sometimes you're sitting there and going, well, maybe I don't have anything really wrong. Maybe there's nothing really wrong with the plat, but you're hearing from neighbors who don't want the use going in, which will come in later. I get it. It puts you all in an awkward situation. But I'm telling you, cities get themselves in trouble all the time when they deny plats for no reason.
So when a plat comes in, strictly the plat, whether the plat is approved or not, like Mike, you say, is black and white. A couple of times where we've had something come in that is a zoning change and a plat, that's different, correct?
Right. So
It is.
I know we switch it up on you from time to time. Usually plats are first on the agenda. when we have those, one of our conditions is this plat is subject to the approval of the later zoning code or zoning change. Because there are regulations in the zoning code that dictate lot size, lot width, and so on. If they don't match up with that zoning district, then we would recommend against the plat. But knowing that they're coming in parallel, we have that little bit extra leeway to say the plat's approved based on the condition the zoning's approved. If the zoning is denied, effectively the plat's denied.
Right.
Because it no longer meets what the current zoning is.
Okay.
And so that's that weird interconnection. And I know we don't get those often. It's probably been, 6-8 months since we've had one come in together. But yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, and, you know, it's an awkward situation for, not only for y'all at times, but for staff. And we'll really, I mean, if I'm at the table with the developer, I'll really ask them, you know, go slower and get, you know, kind of do this incrementally. And sometimes they don't want to do it because they, you know, time is money and they just want to blow and go. And, you know, if we think it's going to be, you know, a big issue, then we'll tell them, well, we think, you know, you're really going to get bogged down. And you can either get bogged down before the commission or you can get bogged down now by virtue of, you know, your act and taking it slower. And so anyway, I guess, you know, what I'm trying to say too is I try to put myself in y'all's position at times and, you know, knowing that you're going to be, you know, addressing a room full of people and you're going to have friends on both sides of the aisle, so to speak. And at the, you know, at the end, you're going to try to get out that door over there instead of the front door. So we do try to keep that in mind. So what is zoning and why do we need it? We've already done that, touched on that slide. You know, and I hear this all the time. I heard it at the short-term rental meeting on Monday, that cities have no authority to regulate those at all. And I just say, well, you know, go back to this Euclid case, go back to the, we have a whole host of cases in Texas. Lombardo is a good example where if you own property and it's in the city, or even in a county for that matter, you hold it subject to valid police power. And we can, and cities do get sued over what quote unquote is valid police power, but in general zoning is, right? And subdivision control is. And so I never get too wound up when someone says that, and I do hear it periodically. I forget, is this your slide or is this my slide? I think this is your slide.
So I had my notes. Nope, that's yours.
Okay, so what is a public purpose? And that, you know, I remind, you know, not only y'all and council periodically that that's what ultimately we're here for. That's what your role is and council's role is. You know, whether they're spending money, there better be a public purpose behind it. And whether when you all are going through either a comp plan amendment or comp plan adoption or zoning, there better be some public purpose behind it. And that's just simply, you know, you're trying to lessen, and this is straight out of state law. You're trying to lessen congestion in the streets. You know, get traffic moving. You're trying to, take steps and adopt regulations in a way that provides safe home ownership or property ownership. You know, so setbacks. Adequate spacing for fire trucks and emergency vehicles to get to that property. You're trying to promote the, of course, health and general welfare. And what does that mean? You know, it's obviously a pretty broad prong. Provide adequate light and air. That's really one of them. Doesn't really impact us too much, but in the bigger cities it does. And the bigger cities certainly have regulations as to, you know, stories and downtown areas and higher dense areas, prevent overcrowding of land, avoid undue concentration of population. You know, yes, you want density, but there's too much of a good thing, right? And there have been studies on when you have really dense areas, the health and safety of the residents suffer. And then you're trying to facilitate certainly adequate transportation and water and sewer and those kind of issues as well.
Kind of digging in again, a little deeper into the zoning code. What we don't get into a lot of times with P and Z, just because most of our cases are straight zoning districts. Each of those zoning districts has a purpose statement, has a land use table that goes with it. We've looked at the land use table several times. Set of development regulations. And so that's where you get into height and number of stories and structures, percentage covered by the lot, or percentage of building on a lot, size of yards, courts, and other spaces, your setbacks, and so on. Population density, our code doesn't have a density requirement in the zoning districts, but it's a function of lot size, setbacks, height restrictions. You start to create a density requirement. The actual location of the buildings, the bulk or the height, the scale of the building, and then of course, historical, cultural, and architectural areas. We don't have much of that in our code. State law has legislated a lot of that out of our authority, except for historic buildings. That's kind of some of the different elements of the zoning code. Where we really start seeing those, and we debated it quite a bit, so where we really start seeing these at this level is with the planned development district, where you guys start seeing each of those sections talks about setbacks, lot size, densities. Again, those are standard in your regular zoning districts. We don't often talk about them here at this level because that's really the development regulations, check and building permits, architectural and civil design, and so on. Getting into procedures, I know we've talked about this recently because we added our own requirement for the property signs, which we have had good feedback from the community, so I think that was a success. Now we're just trying to keep up with all of them. We've had to chase a few of them down. Again, public notification is required in the newspaper. Mailed notice to property owners within 200 feet. Notice must be mailed to the school district on certain kind of classifications. We mail it to school district for everything. Residential and multifamily is kind of the biggest part that obviously impacts the school district. And then public hearing is required, and the recommendation goes to city council for the final approval. Let's see. Simple majority is obviously the vote that we're taking here and council level. However, for city council, if there's a 20% of the area of the 200-foot buffer protest, council is required to have a 3/4 majority vote. I don't think we've had a case that met that threshold since I've been here.
Would you specify that in y'all's recommendation?
It's not, the planning commission's not impacted by that,
Okay.
only city council. So yeah, if we had one between application to city council's first reading where we met that threshold, that's part of our presentation to council is we've reached that 20% threshold. Council does have to approve it with 4 out of 5 votes. Typically, we wouldn't know that by the time we get here. I mean, obviously, we do get some notice before we get here. Some of those real contentious cases, we'll get notices after P&Z's approved it before it goes to council. But again, when you start putting that 20% to a map, it's pretty difficult to get to that point. Streets and alleys are included in that. Obviously, streets don't get a vote. The property itself is included in that. Obviously, it's a positive vote, so there's a big majority of that area already. So I've only seen a handful of cases in my career that have met that threshold. We always talk about due process, the notifications going through the public hearing, and those recommendations on the council. Obviously, it's 14th Amendment. Anything you wanted to add to that one?
No, I mean, this is a big one, you know, both for y'all's and council's perspective. And you just want to give people the right to come in before you and to talk and to give you their viewpoint. And, you know, sometimes I do that by submitting written comments, and that's fine. And we, you know, I think what we do is we add those to the record, even, maybe not to the record, but to the file. Not that you have to read those. And in fact, I tell people, council, you don't need to read that stuff, but it's important for y'all to consider that. And this is where you really, you know, cities can get in big trouble by telling someone, no, you know, you don't have any, there's no time for you to speak. We're only going to take 8 people or whatever it is. And so we really, I mean, I I try to get my client to really bend over backwards and let people speak if they want to. Now, they don't get to, be here till 2 a.m. speaking. They get the 3 or 4 minutes, but I think this is a really important one, particularly in this day and age where you do have people seemingly more engaged in the process and they want their voices to be heard. And, frankly, if they're gonna come down here as opposed to banging on social media, I'd much prefer them come down here and face y'all. It, as awkward as that can be, or a council, and really get out their view, and then, you all hear that and get on down the road.
Mentioned earlier, comprehensive plan is a living document. Again, we do update that through the future land use plan with some of our zone changes. If we have a typical 5 to 10 years is when cities will do an update to the actual plan itself. But it is ever changing as on the implementation plan alone, council and planning commission has been involved in some of them, have checked some of those boxes. We've checked off a lot of those projects that were listed. So as we're adopting those, obviously priorities are shifting to the next layer of importance for the city. So to say that the comprehensive plan is this, solid rock that's never gonna change, obviously the community is gonna change. So the plan that the community is looking at has to change as well. There's one of those right there at the bottom. Our community will never change. Well, we know that's not the truth. As we've seen, just economics, a community that's not changing and not growing is usually dying. So some of the other myths that we talk about, more regulation equals better results. Not necessarily. We've seen both sides of that coin. Increased design standards creates a higher quality development. City codes are the only thing that regulate development. I had this debate with several citizens at the town hall meeting. It's come up here recently a couple times on deed restrictions. The subdivision has the authority to create deed restrictions under state law. Under a separate state law, we can create zoning. It's 2 separate layers of regulation. It's nice and convenient when they all match up. Typically, they don't. From anything from a short-term rental, like we talked about on Monday, I've seen deed restrictions that reference setbacks, sometimes more than or sometimes less than the city requires. I've always argued, at the end of the day, the more restrictive is what applies. I'll issue a permit if you meet my code. It may not meet the deed restriction, and you've got to go through your HOA board or whatever the case is. So there's lots of different layers to that developers, builders, citizens have to keep into mind. One of the things we've heard here a couple times, if we allow one to do it, everyone's going to do it. Kind of case in point, the short-term rental, we don't have 10,000 short-term rentals today, even though we have 10,000 or more homes. So it's kind of statements that you guys get shouted at from the public hearing. Obviously, they're not always true, so. Decision-making, kind of is the color chart that Mike had as far as the level of public input or, public protections. Same kind of thing. You guys know, respectful, thoughtful, compassionate, realistic, informed, and fair. That's kind of, like I said, the neat part you guys get to do. Whereas on our side, we're saying this complies with this code here, here, and here. You guys get to decide if that's adequate or not. Again, compliance with comprehensive plan is a big piece of that. That's why we mention that in every one of our cases. Secondary impacts of the uses to be considered: traffic, noise, light, utilities. It's not only about the property user or the adjacent property sometimes. I can't think of any that we've had here that we've really dug in and said, the zone case meets the comp plan. However, we cannot provide X utility to it, whatever that may be. Our utility system's pretty well thought out, so we don't have that issue. Some communities get to a certain part of town, and while all the policies say we should have X use in this location, however, we cannot provide water, sewer, or electric to it. So how are you going to use that property for that use? And again, what's reasonable? The interesting one that Mike put in here from Palazzolo, 94% in reduction was just a mere diminution. Showing value is not the core of what we're talking about as far as zoning and land use and impacts on the community. continuum that you guys get to feel through each case. Making decisions regarding the application based on the policies and the people. Oftentimes, we've seen policies on one side, the people are on the other. Each case, looking at that continuum, what's appropriate, what's reasonable, and where do you feel that case falls on that spectrum for the overall community? Catch up on my notes here. The development regulations, again, that's a big part of what the zoning is established for. Regulation of those incremental development is good. Approach should be holistic and strive to expand the choice for the community, looking at the entire community, not just the one property owner, the one developer, and the immediate neighborhood. I'll let Mike take this one.
Okay, and then, so that was kind of the broad concepts of zoning and subdivision code and things of that nature. So meeting rules, and here's that phrase again, due process. You know, anything we can do, we have to follow state law with respect to notice, and then anything we can do with respect to transparency and ethics. You know, I'm a firm believer in that. And that's right out of both state law. State law has a provision in there that you all can adopt your own rules. And council has adopted for its boards and commissions board rules, and I don't know if you all have a copy of those. You're supposed to, and so if you don't have one, we can provide a copy. But Drew and I have talked about actually not only making sure you have a copy of those, but maybe even adopting some rules that are specific to planning and zoning. Because I'll be honest, you know, some of these public hearings, I think, you know, while you all do a great job allowing people to speak. Sometimes people are speaking over each other or getting back up to the podium after they have spoken. And I think we can do some stuff to kind of put some guardrails on that, just to make sure everyone in the room is being able to be heard and you all can make a decision within a reasonable period of time. So that, look, as they say, that's like coming to a theater near you. I forget, is this mine or yours?
I think this is all yours.
Okay.
Unless you want to jump in.
I heard this recently too, in one of your meetings, someone got up and was, you know, kind of accusing me of not, you know, making you all comply with Robert's Rules of Order. Well, you all don't have to comply with that because that's not the meeting rules that you all have to follow. When I first got here, council, I think it was actually in the charter, that council had to follow Robert's Rules. And I remember, and they weren't doing it, right? Not that they weren't transparent and not that they weren't providing due process, but finally I ordered a Robert's Rules of Order. I didn't even have one. And I ordered it and I brought it to council and I said, here's the 400-page book that you're supposed to be following. And so they quickly decided at the next charter amendment commission to move forward and get that out of the charter and adopt some rules. And I'll tell you, their council's rules, I didn't write them. The city secretary at the time wrote them. They're phenomenal. I really think they're phenomenal. And we'll probably use that as a guidance for y'all if you want to move forward with that. But I get asked periodically from other cities, hey, we understand you have some good rules. And I think they're not onerous, they're not very lengthy, and at the end of the day, they kind of, there's that old song, don't rock the boat, baby. Rock the boat, don't rock the boat, baby. And I'm dating myself, maybe, but I remember that from my childhood. And that's what I think about in meetings. I really do. I think about, you know, don't do anything that's going to rock the boat, whether it's y'all or even someone speaking from as a member of the public. I think there's ways to get your point across without rocking the boat. That's my point there. Of course, y'all are subject to the Open Meetings Act. And then the chair generally has the control of the meetings, and I know that's a tough deal. Mr. Sigerman's in a precarious situation at times because he has to tell people, we've heard from you, you need to sit down, and I've seen him do it. I've seen our mayors do that, and that's not the easiest thing to do because it might be already a supercharged environment, and you're having to tell people, like, basically be quiet. So. So the Open Meetings Act, which you all are subject to, is we have to post your agendas, notice of them with 72 hours before your meetings. We go way beyond that. A meeting under state law is defined as a gathering of a quorum. So for y'all's purposes, that's four of you all, where public business is discussed. Could include email and it could include phone calls. I've never really had this situation happen here, but I'll just let you know that if I see four of y'all huddled in a corner at Acapulco, I'm probably gonna have a coronary, right? You could go over there and you might be talking about the Cowboys or the Texans, but I'm probably gonna have a coronary. So just don't do that. And again, it might even apply if it's less than a quorum issue. If it's a daisy chain and you think, well, how is that gonna occur? Well, I'm telling you, all anyone has to do is walk across the street to the DA's office, and I like our DAs. I'm not saying it's a problem with them, but they're just like any other DA. If anyone goes in there and they say, hey, I think Planning and Zoning Commission, Mike Sigerman is going person to person outside of meetings and coming up with a decision before the meeting, they're probably gonna at least give that person some leeway and some audience to develop that case, and then we're off and running. So you just have to be careful of that, the daisy chain, and that's, not really gonna probably occur anytime, but the argument is out there and I've seen it periodically with other cities. There is required training that I think you all have already gone through. Obviously, open government must be open to the public. All actions must be taken in open session. So even if we go into executive session, you have to come out and make your motion and take your action outside of that. Ex parte discussions, and that's in the zoning code now. I used to be really, really wary of those, and really, I would counsel Planning and Zoning Commission members and even council members, basically don't talk to anyone outside of a meeting that has a quote-unquote case before you. And then over the years, I don't know if I've softened or I've just kind of gotten to a point where I know it's going to happen, right? What I would say then is, obviously at times you're going to get lobbied and someone's going to pick up the phone and call you and go, hey, and it might be as simple as, I've got an application before you, it's the zoning case. If you have any questions, just here's my contact communication or contact information, and let me know about that. I know we need to hurry, Drew.
Yep.
And
Questions?
But what I'm saying is, if you find yourself in that situation and you talk about something substantive, then by all means, bring that up in a meeting. Not that you have to rat that person out or anything, but just say, hey, I was thinking about this outside of a meeting, and this is what I'm concerned about, and ask the question of staff or ask the question of the applicant, just so you get that out in the public. And I tell council that all the time. Public Information Act, that also applies. Virtually every piece of information, every document that is created for you all, we have to both retain and perhaps even provide pursuant to open records request. So my point is, if you're up there making notes during these meetings, you need to leave your notes and we'll collect those and retain those. Same rule applies to council. Email, social media, I have to remind my kids about this, ease and rapid communication, and the bad is the ease and rapid communication. What you may not want out there is not only going to be out there forever, it's going to be disseminated far and wide, or it could be. It does seem more informal, and so insufficient thought is given to content. Sometimes, I get it. You're at home and you get upset about something you hear, you read online, and boom, you forward something, and then it's off. It's off and running with these forever documents. But my point that I don't want to lose sight of is it can be an open meeting if you all start using email, for instance, back and forth outside of a meeting. And that's why you'll see, I think, from both Steve and Drew, they'll blind copy you on everything, just to make sure you don't do the reply all, because that could constitute a meeting if that leads to some online discussion. Email is unavoidable. We live in that kind of world now, but don't use it for official business, because you risk really opening up your personal computer or your smartphone to disclosure. Don't reply all ever, and really just don't use it in your role as a as a commission member. I tell council the same thing. I mean, just don't use it. Pick up the phone and call people. Fostering open government. I won't go into this. This is ex parte contacts. Again, I just ask you to be very wary of that. And if you're getting lobbied outside of the meeting, make sure that you at least provide that information at a minimum inside the meeting in terms of how you're seeing the issue and how you're going to vote. Hey, I heard this, or I went by the property and this is what I saw from the property and this is why I'm going to vote this way. Ethics, this does apply to you all, this Chapter 171 of the Local Government Code. You all are a local public official. You all are required to abstain, and when you do that and you have to fill out a form, I even recommend you leave the council chambers and go outside. And you have to do that if you have a substantial interest in a business entity or you own real property where it's reasonably foreseeable an action will have an economic effect on your property that's distinguishable from anyone else. And, that occurs, right? And I don't know the properties that you all own. I don't even know where y'all live for the most part. And so if you think there is a zoning case within a reasonable amount of distance from your home or some other property that you own, at a minimum, call me and we'll work through it. Sometimes it's not, just a black and white deal. It might have some gray area. I will tell you, I really side on being conservative on this, and I really try to talk council, for the most part, into recusing themselves at times if they've got, even rental property or whatever, just to recuse themselves, just so you don't have to, defend yourself at a future date over that issue. Substantial interest, real quickly, is 10% or $50,000 of a business. But if you look at what it means for a property interest, real property, it's $2,500 or less. I mean, that's a postage stamp in Kerrville these days. And so, again, if it's reasonably foreseeable that the vote will have a special economic effect on your property, then I would ask you to, at a minimum, call me and we'll work through it and perhaps even get you to do the form. You would have to file the affidavit, and we'll take that to the city secretary. A couple things that have come up, and I've seen this occur. There'll be a planning and zoning commission member who is an applicant for something. I really try to dissuade you all from ever doing that. But if that's unavoidable, then I would get you to recuse yourself and really not even make the presentation. Now you could, and I've seen commission members do that. But it gives me heart palpitations. I'd rather you find a representative, and maybe it's a spouse or maybe it's a realtor or something like that, and they can make the application or the argument to the commission. Again, we've already talked about ex parte contact. The zoning code does prohibit it, lobbying and ex parte contacts. But again, I know people are going to call you because they know who you are, and they know, particularly if you know them in the community and they're a realtor, for instance, or they're, an attorney, and they'll say, hey, I've got an application coming. At a minimum, just call me if there's any questions. I would avoid it, and at a minimum, I would disclose. Again, we've already talked about all sorts of due process, fair and impartial hearings, opportunity to be heard. Once closed, I think for public hearing purposes, I would ask you not to reopen it. I just think it's better. There's a better line in the sand. It's better for us to understand what's on the record and what's not. Public meeting versus a public hearing, yeah, you can distinguish between them. I think you all do this, and I think it's wise. You give people a little bit more leeway in public hearings, and again, I think that's wise. And they certainly have a right under state law to participate in that process. Finally, kind of deal, be objective in your comments and your decision-making. Don't decide really in your mind until you consider all the information, and that'll occur right at the public meeting. So, yeah, you can come in and think, well, if I don't hear anything else, this is how I'm going to decide, but I would try to have an open mind when you come to these meetings. Treat all applicants fairly, even-handedly. It's hard, right? It's a small community. I mean, I go to the store. And inevitably, if I'm not wearing my ball cap down low, someone's gonna ask me about a city issue, right? And so I know that, I get that, and I love the way, that's how Kerrville is, and I love living here because of that. But that happens. Ask questions of staff. I mean, get the record complete with information that you think is pertinent and relevant to the issue at hand, and come prepared to participate. You know, I've seen commission members, not anyone here, but I've seen commission members come when we used to give them packets, and they're opening the packet at the meeting. And I think they're doing disservice to themselves, they're doing disservice to the city and this board, if you don't at least look at the packet and get an idea what the zoning amendment is seeking. I think that's it. So if there's any questions, we can answer those. We meant to give you a little bit more time before your next meeting, but we can give you like 8 seconds.
Are we done?
Yeah, we can email this to you, this presentation, and by all means, Drew's open all the time, I'm open all the time. Come by if you got a question, call us.
I think it'd be a good idea to send a packet to everybody.
Yeah, I can do that.
I mean, not even an email, but maybe a printed packet that you can.
Yeah, I can do that. I'll print one off for each of you.
So are we done?
That's it, unless you guys have questions.
Anybody have questions?
Yeah, why is this so thin?
Next meeting.
If that is it, we will close this workshop at 4:01. Take about a 5-minute break,
Couple minutes?
Yep.
and then we'll open the P and Z meeting.